The autumn wind carried the scent of fallen leaves through the windows of Harrison Karate Academy as Marcus Harrison adjusted his black belt one final time. At 52, the millionaire businessman had built an empire that stretched far beyond the dojo walls, but Saturday mornings remained sacred. This was his time to return to the discipline that had shaped him decades ago. The polished wooden floors reflected the afternoon sunlight streaming through the large windows of his Beverly Hills Academy. Students in crisp white uniforms moved through their kata with precision, their movements sharp and controlled. Marcus observed from the edge of the training floor, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, remembering when he had been just another eager student learning from Master Takeshi Yamamoto. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. Back in 1952, when Marcus was barely 18, karate was still mysterious to most Americans. Master Yamamoto had arrived in Los Angeles, fresh from Okinawa, carrying with him centuries of tradition and wisdom. The old Japanese man had seen something in the young Marcus Harrison that others had missed. While other students came and went, chasing quick belts and flashy techniques, Marcus had stayed, absorbed every lesson, and eventually became Yamamoto's most trusted disciple. Now, 23 years later, Marcus owned a chain of successful dojos across California. His construction company had made him wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, but the principles Master Yamamoto had taught him remained the foundation of everything he did: respect, discipline, perseverance, and above all, loyalty to those who had guided him. As the class ended and students began filing out, Marcus noticed a commotion near the front entrance. Through the glass doors, he could see a young man standing uncertainly on the sidewalk. The stranger appeared to be in his early 20s, with shoulder-length dark hair and clothes that had seen better days. His jeans were faded, his flannel shirt wrinkled, and he carried a worn canvas bag over his shoulder. What caught Marcus's attention, however, was not the young man's appearance, but something else entirely. The way he stood, the subtle positioning of his feet, the controlled breathing even from a distance. These were not the mannerisms of someone unfamiliar with martial arts. The young man approached the front desk where Sarah, the academy's receptionist, greeted him with her usual professional smile. Marcus moved closer, though he remained out of sight behind one of the support pillars that decorated the main training area. "Good afternoon," the young man said, his voice carrying a slight tremor of nervousness. "I was wondering if I could speak with the owner of this dojo." Sarah glanced toward the training floor where Marcus usually spent his Saturday afternoons. "Mr. Harrison is here today. May I ask what this is regarding?" The stranger hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "My name is David Chen. I believe he knew my sensei, Master Takeshi Yamamoto." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. He stepped out from behind the pillar, his heart racing in a way it hadn't in years. Master Yamamoto had been dead for nearly a decade, killed in a car accident that had devastated the small karate community they had built together in Los Angeles. "I'm Marcus Harrison," he said, approaching the front desk with measured steps. "You mentioned Master Yamamoto." David turned to face him, and Marcus felt another shock of recognition, not because he had seen this young man before, but because of what he saw in his eyes. There was a depth there, a quiet intensity that reminded him powerfully of his old teacher. More than that, there was something familiar about the bone structure of his face, the way he carried himself. "Yes, sir," David replied, bowing respectfully in the traditional manner. The bow was perfect, neither too shallow nor too deep, executed with the kind of precision that came only from years of proper training. "Master Yamamoto was my teacher for the last 8 years of his life. He spoke of you often." Marcus felt his throat tighten. After Yamamoto's death, he had tried to track down any other students the master might have been teaching privately, but had found no trace of anyone. The old man had been secretive about his personal life, especially in his later years. "Where did you train with him?" Marcus asked, studying the young man's face more carefully. There was definitely something familiar there, something that went beyond mere coincidence. "In a small dojo he ran in Little Tokyo," David answered. "It wasn't much, just a converted garage behind his apartment building. He never advertised, never took many students. Just a few of us who found our way to him somehow." Marcus knew the area well. Master Yamamoto had lived modestly despite Marcus's repeated offers to help him financially. The proud old teacher had insisted on maintaining his independence, teaching only those he felt truly understood the deeper philosophy of karate. You said he spoke of me, Marcus continued, gesturing for David to sit on one of the benches near the entrance. What did he tell you? David's expression softened, and for a moment, the nervous tension seemed to leave his shoulders. He told me about his first American student, a young man who understood that karate was not about fighting, but about building character. He said you were like a son to him. The words struck deep. Marcus had always suspected that Master Yamamoto viewed their relationship as more than just teacher and student. But the old man had never been one for sentimental expressions. Hearing it confirmed by this stranger brought back a flood of memories and emotions Marcus had buried for years. He also told me, David continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, that if something ever happened to him, I should find you. He said you would know what to do. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. The implications of what David was saying began to crystallize in his mind. This wasn't just a casual visit from a fellow student of his old master. This was something more significant, something that Yamamoto had planned for. As he looked more closely at David's features, studying the shape of his eyes and the structure of his face, Marcus began to understand why the young man seemed so familiar. The resemblance to Master Yamamoto was subtle, but unmistakable once he knew what to look for. Marcus stared at David Chen for a long moment, the pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed beginning to fall into place. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dojo floor, and the familiar sounds of traffic on Wilshire Boulevard seemed to fade into the background as the weight of realization settled upon him. David, Marcus said carefully. How old are you? 22, sir, the young man replied, his hands resting respectfully on his knees as he sat on the bench. Marcus did the mental calculation quickly. That would place David's birth around 1953, just a year after Marcus had begun training with Master Yamamoto. The timeline fit perfectly with something he had always wondered about, but never dared to ask his sensei directly. Tell me about your mother, Marcus said gently. David's expression grew distant, as if he were reaching back through painful memories. She died when I was 14. Cancer. She was Japanese-American, born in one of the internment camps during the war. Her name was Keiko. The name hit Marcus like a thunderbolt. He remembered Keiko well, a beautiful and intelligent woman who had occasionally visited the original dojo in the early 50s. She had been quiet and respectful, always bowing properly when she entered. But Marcus had noticed the way Master Yamamoto's entire demeanor changed when she was present. The stern teacher became softer, more human somehow. Keiko Nakamura, Marcus said, not really asking a question. David's eyes widened in surprise. You knew her? I met her several times at the old dojo. She and Master Yamamoto. Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. They cared for each other very much. What Marcus didn't say was that he had always suspected there was more to their relationship than either had admitted. In 1950s America, interracial relationships faced enormous social challenges, and for a traditional Japanese man like Yamamoto, the situation would have been even more complicated. The karate master had never married, never spoke of family, and had always maintained a carefully constructed distance from personal attachments. After she died, David continued, his voice steady despite the obvious pain the subject caused him. I had nowhere to go. The state was going to put me in a home, but somehow Master Yamamoto found out. He took me in and became my legal guardian. That's when he started teaching me karate seriously. Marcus felt a deep ache in his chest. Master Yamamoto had been caring for his own son all those years and had never said a word. The old man had carried that secret, that responsibility, in complete silence. It explained so many things. Why Yamamoto had become more reclusive in his later years. Why he had turned down Marcus's invitations to dinner or social gatherings. Why he had always seemed to be carrying some invisible burden. He never told you, David said, reading the expression on Marcus's face. About me, I mean. No, Marcus admitted. He never did. But I should have figured it out. You have his eyes, his way of standing. Even the way you bow. Marcus shook his head in amazement. Master Yamamoto was always intensely private. But this... He made me promise never to tell anyone while he was alive, David explained. He said it would complicate things, that people wouldn't understand. But he also made me promise that if anything happened to him, I would find you. He said you were the only person he trusted completely. Marcus stood up and began pacing slowly across the dojo floor. The implications of this revelation were staggering. Master Yamamoto had not just been his teacher and mentor, but had been raising a son in secret, a son who was now sitting in his dojo, apparently in need of help. What happened after he died? Marcus asked, turning back to face David. The young man's composure cracked slightly. I tried to keep going on my own. I was 19 when the accident happened. I got a job at a warehouse, found a cheap apartment in Little Tokyo. I kept training in the old garage dojo for a while, but the landlord eventually rented it to someone else. He paused, running a hand through his dark hair. I've been drifting since then, working odd jobs, moving from place to place, but I never stopped practicing what he taught me. Marcus could see the pain behind David's carefully controlled exterior. The young man had lost not just a teacher, but a father figure, and had been struggling alone ever since. The fact that he had waited 3 years to seek out Marcus spoke to either tremendous independence or stubborn pride, traits he would have inherited from Master Yamamoto. Show me, Marcus said suddenly. David looked confused. Sir, show me your karate. I want to see what Master Yamamoto taught you. Without hesitation, David stood and removed his flannel shirt, revealing a plain white t-shirt underneath. He walked to the center of the training floor and took a moment to center himself. Marcus watched as the young man's breathing deepened and his stance settled into something unmistakably familiar. What happened next took Marcus's breath away. David moved through, a kata that Marcus recognized immediately, but had not seen performed in over a decade. It was one of the advanced forms that Master Yamamoto had learned directly from his own teacher in Okinawa, a kata so traditional and precise that very few people in America had ever seen it, let alone mastered it. But David had not just learned it, he had perfected it. Every movement flowed with the kind of natural grace that came from years of dedicated practice. His techniques were sharp without being harsh, powerful without being forced. It was as if Marcus were watching Master Yamamoto himself. 20 years younger, when David finished, he bowed to the 4 directions and then to Marcus, his breathing barely elevated despite the intensity of the performance. My God, Marcus whispered. He taught you everything, didn't he? David nodded. He said I was his legacy, that everything he had learned from his masters in Okinawa, everything he had discovered through his own training, was now mine to carry forward. He paused, but he also said that knowledge without wisdom was dangerous, and that I would need guidance to understand the deeper meanings. He said only you could provide that guidance. Marcus felt the full weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Master Yamamoto had not just revealed a secret son, he had entrusted Marcus with continuing the most sacred aspect of his teaching. This young man represented not just a personal connection to his beloved sensei, but the preservation of centuries of martial arts tradition. David, Marcus said formally, are you prepared to dedicate yourself completely to the path your father began teaching you? The use of the word father caused David's eyes to well up with tears, though his voice remained steady. Yes, sensei, it's all I've ever wanted. Marcus bowed deeply to the young man, a gesture that acknowledged not just student to teacher, but the profound connection they shared through Master Yamamoto's legacy. Then we begin tomorrow, Marcus said. And there's something else you need to know about your father. Something that will help you understand why he was so secretive, and why your training is more important than you realize. The truth Marcus was about to reveal would change David's understanding of everything. Marcus led David to his private office at the back of the academy, a space that reflected both his success and his connection to traditional martial arts. The walls were lined with photographs from decades of training, tournament victories, and formal ceremonies. In the place of honor behind his desk hung a large portrait of Master Yamamoto, taken during a demonstration in 1958. David stopped when he saw the photograph, his breath catching slightly. I remember when he had that jai, he said softly. He still wore it sometimes during our private lessons, even though it was getting threadbare. Marcus poured 2 cups of tea from the pot he kept warm on a side table, a habit he had maintained since his early days of training. Master Yamamoto had always insisted that important conversations should be accompanied by tea, claiming it helped focus the mind and calm the spirit. Sit down, Marcus said, settling into his chair behind the desk. We need to talk about what happens next. David accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. Up close, Marcus could see the toll that months of uncertainty had taken on the young man. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his clothes hung loosely on a frame that had clearly lost weight recently. First things first, Marcus continued. You need a place to stay. There's an apartment above the dojo that I use sometimes when I'm working late. It's yours for as long as you need it. David started to protest, but Marcus held up a hand to stop him. This isn't charity, Marcus said firmly. Master Yamamoto would have expected me to look after his son. More than that, I can see from your kata that you're a serious martial artist. This academy needs someone who understands traditional karate, not just the tournament sport version that's becoming popular. It was true. Marcus had built a successful chain of schools, but he worried sometimes that the essence of what Master Yamamoto had taught him was being lost in the pursuit of trophies and belt promotions. The students were technically proficient, but few of them seemed to grasp the deeper philosophical aspects of the art. I want to earn my place, David said quietly. I don't want handouts, even from someone who knew my father. Marcus smiled, recognizing the pride that had been another of Master Yamamoto's defining characteristics. Then you'll work for it. I need an assistant instructor, someone who can teach the traditional forms and help the advanced students understand the historical context of what they're learning. The pay isn't much to start, but it comes with room and board. David looked up from his tea, hope flickering in his eyes for the first time since he had walked through the door. You would trust me to teach your students? I would trust Master Yamamoto's son to teach my students, Marcus corrected. But first, I need to understand what you know and what you still need to learn. Your kata was excellent, but there's more to being an instructor than technical skill. Over the next hour, Marcus questioned David about his training, his understanding of karate philosophy, and his experience with teaching. What he discovered impressed him. Despite his youth, David had a deep grasp of traditional Okinawan karate that went far beyond mere physical technique. Master Yamamoto had clearly invested years in developing not just David's skills, but his character and understanding. He made me study the history, David explained, not just the techniques, but why they were developed, how they were used, what they meant to the people who created them. He said too many American karate schools were teaching empty movements, techniques divorced from their purpose and meaning. Marcus nodded approvingly. This was exactly the kind of understanding he wanted to see in his instructors. Most of the black belts he had trained over the years were competent fighters and capable teachers, but few had developed the deeper appreciation for karate as a cultural art form. What about weapons training? Marcus asked. Did he teach you Kabudo? David's face lit up. Bosai Nunchaku and Tonfa. He said they were part of the complete Okinawan system, that learning them helped understand the empty hand techniques better. This was getting better and better. Marcus had been looking for someone qualified to teach the traditional weapons classes that several students had been requesting. Most of the instructors he knew treated Kabudo as a flashy addition to regular karate, but Master Yamamoto had always taught it as an integral part of the complete martial art. There's something else we need to discuss, Marcus said, his tone becoming more serious. Master Yamamoto left something with me before he died, something he said should go to his heir when the time was right. Marcus opened the large safe behind his desk and withdrew a silk-wrapped bundle. He placed it carefully on the desk between them and slowly unwrapped it, revealing a katana in a simple black scabbard. David's eyes widened. I've never seen that before. This belonged to Master Yamamoto's grandfather, the one who taught him karate in Okinawa. It's over 200 years old, made by a master swordsmith during the Edo period. Master Yamamoto brought it with him when he came to America, but he never displayed it publicly. He said it would go to his successor in the art. Marcus lifted the sword carefully, feeling the perfect balance that marked truly superior craftsmanship. The blade, when he partially drew it, gleamed with the subtle patterns of folded steel that indicated traditional Japanese forging techniques. I can't accept this, David said, his voice filled with awe. It's too valuable, too important. It's not about value, Marcus replied, rewrapping the sword carefully. It's about continuity. Master Yamamoto wanted his lineage to continue, wanted the traditions he learned in Okinawa to survive in America. This sword represents that continuity. He placed the wrapped katana back in David's hands. Your father trusted me to know when the time was right to pass this on. That time is now. David held the sword with obvious reverence, understanding the weight of responsibility it represented. What if I'm not worthy of it? What if I can't live up to his example? Marcus leaned back in his chair, remembering his own doubts when Master Yamamoto had first begun treating him as more than just another student. Worthiness isn't something you're born with, he said. It's something you earn through dedication, study, and service to others. Your father saw potential in you, just as he saw it in me. The question isn't whether you're worthy now, but whether you're willing to work to become worthy. David nodded slowly, clutching the sword to his chest. I want to try. I want to honor his memory and carry on what he taught me. Then we start tomorrow, Marcus said, rising from his chair. First thing in the morning, I'll show you the apartment and introduce you to the other instructors. We'll begin with you assisting in the children's classes, then work your way up to the adult sessions as you get comfortable with our teaching methods. As they prepared to leave the office, Marcus felt a sense of completion he hadn't experienced in years. Master Yamamoto's death had left a void in his life, a feeling that something important had been left unfinished. Now, with David's arrival, he understood what that missing piece had been. The lineage would continue. The traditions would survive, and perhaps most importantly, he would have the chance to repay the debt he owed to the man who had shaped his life in ways that went far beyond martial arts. The apartment above the dojo was modest but comfortable, furnished with simple wooden furniture that reflected Marcus's preference for functional elegance. David stood in the doorway, still hardly believing that this was really happening. 3 days ago, he had been sleeping in his car in a parking lot behind a fast food restaurant. Now he had a roof over his head and the prospect of meaningful work doing what he loved most. The previous tenant was one of my senior instructors, Marcus explained, opening the windows to let in fresh air. When he moved to open his own school in San Diego, I decided to keep it available for visiting teachers or special circumstances. David set his worn canvas bag on the small dining table, everything he owned fitting into that single container. The contrast between his meager possessions and the comfortable surroundings wasn't lost on him, but he was determined to prove himself worthy of Marcus's faith. I want you to understand something, Marcus continued, turning to face him directly. I'm not doing this just because of your connection to Master Yamamoto. I'm doing it because I can see the same dedication in you that I saw in myself when I was your age. But dedication alone isn't enough. You'll need to earn the respect of the other instructors and the students. David nodded seriously. I understand. What should I expect? Marcus considered the question carefully. Some of the instructors have been with me for years. They're good people, but they're used to American-style karate training. The traditional Okinawan methods your father taught might seem strange to them at first. Don't try to change everything at once. Observe, learn how we do things here, and find ways to integrate what you know gradually. The next morning, David arrived at the dojo early, dressed in the clean white gi that Marcus had provided. He had spent hours the night before practicing kata in the small apartment, wanting to make sure he was at his best for his first day as an instructor. Marcus introduced him to the teaching staff during their morning meeting. There was Jennifer Walsh, a third-degree black belt who specialized in tournament competition, and Robert Kim, a former military police officer who taught the self-defense classes. Both were polite but reserved, clearly withholding judgment until they could see David in action. David will be starting with the children's classes, Marcus announced. He has extensive experience in traditional Okinawan karate, and I think he'll bring a valuable perspective to our program. The first class consisted of 12 children ranging from 6 to 12 years old, all wearing colorful belts that indicated their various ranks. David felt a moment of nervousness as they lined up and bowed, but the feeling passed quickly as he began leading them through basic techniques. What struck him immediately was their enthusiasm. These children approached karate with joy and excitement, something that had been largely absent from his training with Master Yamamoto. The old man had been a firm believer in serious, disciplined practice, but David could see the value in making learning enjoyable for young students. Sensei David, one of the younger students called out during a break. Why do you bow differently than Sensei Marcus? David smiled, recognizing an opportunity to share some of the cultural knowledge his father had imparted to him. In Okinawa, where karate comes from, there are different ways to show respect. The way I bow comes from a very old tradition. He demonstrated the deeper, more formal bow that Master Yamamoto had taught him, explaining its significance in simple terms that the children could understand. To his surprise, they listened intently, fascinated by this glimpse into the historical roots of their art. After the class ended, Jennifer approached him with a thoughtful expression. That was interesting, she said. I've never seen kids that engaged when talking about history and tradition. Usually, they just want to learn the flashy kicks and punches. Master Yamamoto always said that understanding the why behind the techniques made them more meaningful. David replied, even for children, there's value in knowing they're part of something bigger than just learning to fight. Over the following weeks, David gradually found his place within the academy's structure. He assisted with various classes, always careful to support the lead instructor rather than trying to impose his own methods. But slowly, elements of traditional Okinawan training began to appear in the curriculum. He introduced breathing exercises that Master Yamamoto had taught him, simple meditation techniques that helped students focus their minds before training. He showed them applications for kata movements that many had been performing without understanding their practical purpose. Most significantly, he began incorporating the philosophical aspects of karate that his father had emphasized. The changes were subtle but noticeable. Students began approaching their training with greater seriousness and respect. Parents commented on how their children were applying karate principles at home and school, showing improved discipline and self-control. Marcus watched these developments with growing satisfaction. He had built successful schools by adapting traditional martial arts to American expectations, but he had always worried that something essential was being lost in the process. David's presence was helping to restore that missing element without alienating students who were accustomed to more modern teaching methods. One evening, after the last class had ended, Marcus found David practicing alone in the main training hall. The young man was working through an advanced kata that Marcus didn't recognize, his movements flowing like water while maintaining the explosive power that marked true mastery. "I haven't seen that form before," Marcus said, approaching quietly so as not to disturb the practice. David completed the sequence and turned to face him, breathing deeply but not winded despite the complexity of what he had just performed. "It's called Seisan, one of the oldest kata in Shorin-ryu. Master Yamamoto said it contained the essential principles of our style." "Show me the opening sequence," Marcus requested, genuinely curious about this aspect of his old teacher's knowledge that had never been shared with him. As David demonstrated the initial movements, Marcus could see layers of application that went far beyond simple self-defense techniques. This was combat strategy distilled into movement, centuries of accumulated wisdom preserved in a form that could be passed from teacher to student across generations. "Your father never taught me this kata," Marcus admitted. "I'm beginning to realize there was much more to his knowledge than I ever understood." David paused in his explanation, looking uncertain. He said some things were meant to be taught only to family, techniques that were too dangerous to share widely. "But if you were like a son to him..." Marcus felt a complex mix of emotions at this revelation. Part of him felt hurt that Master Yamamoto had withheld advanced teachings, but he also understood the traditional reasoning behind such restrictions. In Okinawa, martial arts lineages were often closely guarded family secrets. "Perhaps," he said finally, "it's time for those secrets to have a wider family to belong to. If you're willing to teach, I'm certainly willing to learn." David's face lit up with genuine joy. Master Yamamoto always said that teaching and learning should never stop, no matter how advanced you become. I would be honored to share what he taught me. As they began working through the kata together, Marcus reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. David's arrival had not only brought new knowledge and perspectives to the academy, but had also reconnected Marcus with the deeper roots of his own training. The young man was proving to be far more than just Master Yamamoto's son. He was becoming a bridge between the traditional past and the evolving future of karate in America. 3 months had passed since David's arrival at the Harrison Karate Academy, and his integration into the teaching staff had exceeded even Marcus's optimistic expectations. The young man possessed a natural gift for instruction that went beyond technical knowledge, demonstrating the kind of patience and insight that usually took years to develop. However, not everyone was pleased with the changes David had brought to the academy. Richard Blackwood stood in the parking lot across the street from the dojo, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the casual afternoon crowd. At 45, he owned the largest chain of martial arts schools in Southern California, built on aggressive marketing and tournament success rather than traditional values. He had been watching the Harrison Academy for weeks, noting the increased enrollment and the buzz of excitement surrounding their new instructor. "So this is Master Yamamoto's secret student," Richard muttered to himself, observing David through the large windows as he led an advanced class through weapon forms. Interesting. Richard had his own history with Master Yamamoto, though it was not one he advertised. 20 years ago, he had approached the old master seeking to learn traditional Okinawan karate, believing it would give him an edge in the competitive martial arts market. Yamamoto had refused to teach him after only 3 lessons, claiming that Richard's motivations were impure and his character unsuited for serious martial arts study. The rejection had stung deeply, driving Richard to prove the old man wrong by building a martial arts empire that dwarfed anything Yamamoto or his students had achieved. But success had not erased the memory of that humiliation, and seeing David now teaching the very techniques he had been denied rekindled old resentments. Inside the dojo, David was unaware of the scrutiny from across the street. He was focused entirely on his students, a group of brown and black belts who had requested advanced weapons training. In his hands, the bow staff moved like an extension of his body, flowing through complex patterns that demonstrated both defensive and offensive applications. The weapon should feel natural, he explained, pausing to adjust one student's grip. In Okinawa, these techniques developed from farming tools that people used every day. The movements grew out of practical necessity, not abstract theory. Among the students was Jennifer Walsh, who had initially been skeptical of David's traditional approach, but had gradually become one of his strongest supporters. Her tournament background gave her an appreciation for effective technique, and she could see that David's methods produced results that went deeper than mere physical skill. "Sensei David," she asked during a brief break, "I've been wondering about something. Some of the kata you've taught us aren't in any of the reference books I've studied. Where do they come from?" David hesitated for a moment, glancing toward Marcus's office where the older man was meeting with potential franchise partners. They had discussed this question before, and Marcus had encouraged him to be open about his background. But David still felt uncertain about revealing family secrets to a wider audience. "They're from Master Yamamoto's family lineage," he said finally. "Kata that were passed down through generations in Okinawa but never written down or widely taught. He believed they were too important to lose, but too dangerous to share carelessly." The explanation created a stir of excitement among the students. The idea that they were learning secret techniques from an ancient lineage added an element of mystique that appealed to their romantic notions about martial arts, but it also attracted attention that David hadn't anticipated. Word of the secret kata spread quickly through the Southern California martial arts community. Other instructors began visiting the academy, ostensibly for friendly exchanges, but actually to observe David's teaching methods. Some came with genuine respect for traditional knowledge, but others arrived with more predatory intentions. One evening, as David was locking up after the last class, he found Richard Blackwood waiting by his car in the parking lot. The man's presence immediately put David on edge, though he couldn't articulate why. "David Chen, I presume," Richard said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Richard Blackwood. I own several schools in the area, and I've been hearing interesting things about your teaching methods." David bowed politely, as Master Yamamoto had taught him to do when meeting other martial artists. "Mr. Blackwood, I've heard of your schools. You have quite a reputation in tournament competition." "Indeed I do," Richard replied, his tone carrying a subtle undertone of superiority. "I understand you studied with old Master Yamamoto. Tragic what happened to him, really. Such a waste of knowledge when these old masters die without properly documenting their methods." Something in the way Richard spoke about his father made David's jaw tighten, but he maintained his composure. Master Yamamoto believed in preserving tradition through direct transmission from teacher to student. He felt that written records couldn't capture the full essence of the art. Richard circled slowly around David's car, examining it with obvious disdain. The vehicle was old and showed signs of hard use, a reminder of David's recent struggles with homelessness. "Of course, tradition is all well and good, but it doesn't pay the bills, does it? I imagine working as an assistant instructor doesn't provide much financial security." "I'm satisfied with my situation," David replied carefully, sensing that this conversation was leading somewhere he didn't want to go. "That's admirable," Richard said, stopping directly in front of David. "But I wonder if you've considered your long-term prospects. Marcus Harrison is a good man, but he's old-fashioned. His business model is decades behind the times. Meanwhile, I'm always looking for instructors with authentic traditional knowledge. Someone with your background could command a very substantial salary working for me." David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. What exactly are you suggesting? Richard's smile widened, taking on a predatory quality. I'm suggesting that those family kata you've been teaching could be worth a great deal of money to the right organization. My schools have hundreds of students who would pay premium rates for access to authentic secret techniques. We could package them as exclusive seminars, maybe produce some instructional videos. The profit potential is enormous. The suggestion hit David like a physical blow. The idea of commercializing his father's sacred teachings, of turning centuries-old family traditions into marketing tools, was so fundamentally wrong that he struggled to find words to respond. "Those kata aren't for sale," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "They're not products to be marketed. They're part of a living tradition that carries responsibilities along with knowledge." Richard's expression darkened slightly, revealing the calculating businessman beneath the friendly facade. "Everything is for sale, David. It's just a matter of finding the right price. You might want to think about that, especially given your current circumstances. Loyalty is a luxury that people in your position can rarely afford." With that parting shot, Richard walked away, leaving David standing alone in the parking lot with a growing sense of unease. The encounter had revealed threats he hadn't anticipated, challenges that went beyond simple technical instruction or business competition. As he drove home to his small apartment above the dojo, David found himself thinking about the weight of responsibility that came with preserving his father's legacy. Master Yamamoto had trusted him with knowledge that was both precious and dangerous, techniques that could be powerful tools for character development or devastating weapons in the wrong hands. The question now was whether he was strong enough to protect that legacy from those who would exploit it for their own gain. Marcus noticed the change in David immediately the next morning. The young man went through the motions of teaching his classes with his usual technical precision, but the joy and enthusiasm that had marked his first months at the academy seemed diminished. During the lunch break, Marcus found David sitting alone in the small garden behind the dojo, staring at the koi pond that Master Yamamoto had helped design years earlier. "Something's troubling you," Marcus observed, settling onto the wooden bench beside him. "Want to talk about it?" David remained silent for several minutes, watching the fish move in slow circles through the clear water. Finally, he spoke without looking up. "Someone approached me last night. Richard Blackwood. He made me an offer." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He knew Blackwood by reputation, and none of what he knew was good. The man had built his martial arts empire through aggressive business practices and shameless self-promotion, treating traditional arts as commodities to be packaged and sold to the highest bidder. "What kind of offer?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew. "He wants to buy the kata Master Yamamoto taught me," David replied, his voice filled with disgust. "He talked about turning them into premium seminars and instructional videos, said I could make a fortune selling family secrets to his students." Marcus nodded grimly. This was exactly the kind of exploitation that Master Yamamoto had feared. The reason he had been so careful about whom he taught and how much knowledge he shared. The old master had seen how commercialization was already changing martial arts in America, turning ancient traditions into entertainment and spiritual practices into sporting events. "I hope you told him where he could put his offer," Marcus said. "I did," David confirmed, "but he made it clear that this wasn't really a request. He said loyalty was a luxury I couldn't afford, given my circumstances. I think he's going to make trouble for us." As if summoned by their conversation, Richard Blackwood appeared at the garden gate, flanked by two men in expensive suits who clearly weren't martial artists. One carried a briefcase, while the other had the watchful demeanor of private security. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Richard called out with false cheerfulness. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I have some business to discuss with both of you." Marcus stood slowly, his body language shifting into the alert readiness that Master Yamamoto had drilled into him decades earlier. "This is private property, Blackwood. State your business or leave." Richard's smile faltered slightly, but he pressed forward. "Actually, that's exactly what I want to discuss. Private property, intellectual property, and the legal obligations that come with both." The man with the briefcase stepped forward and handed Marcus a thick sheaf of legal documents. "Mr. Harrison, my client has reason to believe that techniques being taught at your academy may infringe on copyrighted material owned by Blackwood Enterprises." Marcus glanced at the papers, his lawyer's training from his business dealings, helping him recognize the basic structure of a cease and desist order. "This is ridiculous. Traditional karate kata can't be copyrighted. They're centuries old." Ah, but modern variations and teaching methods can be, Richard replied smugly. I've been very careful to document and register my curriculum over the years. Any techniques that bear substantial similarity to my copyrighted material could be considered infringement. David stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. Those kata belong to my family lineage. They were never yours to copyright. Prove it, Richard challenged. Show me the documentation. Where are the written records establishing your claim to these techniques? Where is the legal transfer of intellectual property from Master Yamamoto to you? The question struck at the heart of traditional martial arts transmission. Knowledge passed from teacher to student through direct instruction, demonstrated technique and oral tradition. There were no written contracts, no legal documents establishing ownership of kata that had been developed over generations of practice. Master Yamamoto believed in preserving tradition through living transmission, David said, his voice steady despite his obvious anger. The techniques aren't property to be owned. They're part of a cultural heritage that belongs to all serious practitioners. Richard laughed harshly. That's a beautiful sentiment, but it doesn't hold up in court. In America, intellectual property law is very clear. Without documentation proving prior ownership, any technique I can demonstrate having taught first becomes my legal property. Marcus felt a cold realization settling in his stomach. Blackwood was right about the legal technicalities, even if he was morally wrong about everything else. The man had clearly done his research, finding a way to use American intellectual property law to steal traditional knowledge that rightfully belonged to others. What do you want? Marcus asked bluntly. Simple, Richard replied. David comes to work for me, bringing his knowledge of traditional techniques with him. In exchange, I'll graciously allow your academy to continue operating without filing copyright infringement lawsuits that could bankrupt you. The threat was clear and devastating. Even if Marcus could eventually win such a lawsuit, the legal costs would destroy his business long before the case was resolved. Richard had found a way to weaponize the legal system against traditional martial arts, using bureaucratic complexity to accomplish what he couldn't achieve through honest competition. And if I refuse? David asked. Richard's expression grew cold. Then I'll file suit against both of you tomorrow morning. I'll claim that every technique David has taught here infringes on my copyrighted curriculum. I'll seek damages for lost revenue, demand immediate cessation of all classes, and tie you up in court for years. He paused, letting the threat sink in before delivering his final blow. I'll also make sure that every martial arts magazine and website in the country knows that the great Marcus Harrison is teaching stolen techniques. Your reputation in the community will be destroyed. Marcus felt rage building in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Master Yamamoto had always taught that anger was the enemy of clear thinking, that emotional reactions led to poor decisions. This was clearly a situation that required careful strategy rather than immediate action. We need time to consider your proposal, Marcus said finally. Of course, Richard replied, his smile returning. Take all the time you need. You have until tomorrow evening to decide. After that, my lawyers will be filing papers with the court. As Richard and his associates left the garden, David sank back onto the bench, his head in his hands. This is my fault, he said quietly. I should never have taught those kata to anyone. Master Yamamoto warned me about people who would try to exploit traditional knowledge for profit. Marcus sat down beside him, placing a firm hand on the young man's shoulder. This isn't your fault. This is about greed and corruption, about someone using legal technicalities to steal what doesn't belong to him. But what can we do? David asked. He's right about the law. Without written documentation proving my inheritance of those techniques, he can claim them as his own. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities. Then slowly, an idea began to form. It was risky, possibly dangerous, but it might be their only chance to protect Master Yamamoto's legacy from exploitation. There might be a way, he said finally, but it's going to require us to take some chances, and it's going to test everything your father taught you about honor and tradition. David looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. What do you mean? Marcus smiled grimly. I mean, it's time to remind Richard Blackwood that martial arts isn't just about business and legal contracts. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways to settle disputes. That evening, Marcus made a phone call that he hadn't expected to make in over 15 years. The number belonged to Sensei Kenji Tanaka, one of the most respected martial arts masters on the West Coast and a direct student of several legendary Okinawan teachers. More importantly, Tanaka was known throughout the community as a man of uncompromising integrity who had dedicated his life to preserving authentic martial arts traditions. The council consisted of 7 senior masters, men and women who collectively represented over 3 centuries of martial arts experience. Marcus recognized most of them by reputation, though he had personal relationships with only a few. They sat in a semicircle on the polished wooden floor, their collective presence creating an atmosphere of solemn authority. Tanaka served as the presiding master, his voice carrying formal gravity as he explained the situation to the assembled council. He read the copyright claims that Blackwood had made, outlined the traditional lineage that David represented, and detailed the challenge that had been issued according to classical protocols. The question before us, Tanaka concluded, is whether this young man has demonstrated sufficient mastery and understanding to defend his family's martial heritage through formal combat. One by one, the council members questioned David about his training, his understanding of traditional principles, and his knowledge of the disputed kata. The examination was thorough and demanding, probing not just his technical skills but his character and motivations. Master Catherine Wong, a 60-year-old woman who had trained in both Chinese and Japanese martial arts, asked the most penetrating questions. "Young man, if you win this challenge, what do you intend to do with the knowledge your father passed to you? Will you commercialize it as Blackwood wishes to do?" David considered the question carefully before responding. "Master Yamamoto taught me that these techniques carry responsibilities along with power. They should be shared only with students who demonstrate proper character and dedication, never for profit alone, and never without ensuring that the philosophical foundations are understood along with the physical movements." Master Wong nodded approvingly. "And if you lose, if this Blackwood gains legal control over your family's kata, then I'll have failed in my most important duty," David replied quietly. "But at least I'll have tried to honor my father's trust." The questioning continued for nearly 2 hours, covering everything from technical applications to ethical considerations. Finally, the council withdrew to deliberate in private, leaving Marcus and David to wait in nervous silence. When the masters returned, their expressions were uniformly serious. Tanaka spoke for the group. "We have determined that David Chen is the legitimate heir to Master Yamamoto's teachings and has demonstrated sufficient mastery to defend that lineage through formal challenge. The council will officially witness and judge any combat that results from this dispute." Before Marcus could express his relief, Tanaka held up a hand for silence. "However, we must inform you that Mr. Blackwood has responded to the challenge. He will appear before this council tomorrow evening with his own representative." "Did he say who he's bringing?" Marcus asked, though he suspected the answer wouldn't be encouraging. "A man named Carlos Mendez," Tanaka replied. "Are you familiar with him?" Marcus felt his stomach drop. Mendez was a former professional kickboxer who had transitioned into martial arts instruction after his fighting career ended. He was technically skilled, physically powerful, and completely ruthless in competition. More troubling, he was known to have studied with several traditional masters before opening his own commercial school. "He's dangerous," Marcus said simply. "Good enough to have learned some traditional kata, strong enough to hurt David badly if this gets out of hand." "The rules will be strict," Tanaka assured him. "Traditional weapons kata will be demonstrated first, judged on accuracy, understanding, and spiritual content. Only if that portion is inconclusive will there be actual combat, and it will be controlled sparring with protective equipment." David spoke up for the first time since the questioning had ended. "What happens if Mendez knows the kata? If Blackwood has taught him the techniques he's trying to copyright?" It was a troubling possibility that Marcus hadn't fully considered. If Blackwood had systematically stolen techniques from multiple traditional schools over the years, he might have assembled enough knowledge to create a convincing facade of legitimacy. Master Wong answered the question. Traditional kata are not just sequences of movements. They carry subtle details of timing, breathing, and application that take years to master. A true inheritor of a lineage demonstrates understanding that goes far beyond memorized techniques. As the council began to disperse, Tanaka approached David with a final piece of advice. "Tomorrow evening, you will not just be fighting for your family's honor. You will be fighting for the principle that traditional knowledge cannot be bought and sold like a commodity. Remember that when you step onto the floor." The drive home passed in contemplative silence. Both Marcus and David understood that they had committed themselves to a course of action that could have far-reaching consequences. If David lost tomorrow, it wouldn't just mean surrendering Master Yamamoto's techniques to Blackwood. It would establish a precedent that traditional martial arts lineages could be stolen through legal manipulation and settled through hired champions rather than legitimate inheritance. Back at the academy, Marcus found David standing in the main training hall, staring at the portrait of Master Yamamoto that hung on the wall of honor. The old master's calm, dignified expression seemed to look down at his son with quiet encouragement. "He never told me it would be this complicated," David said without turning around. "When I was learning those kata, they seemed like beautiful ancient dances. I never imagined they would become the center of a legal and physical battle." Marcus joined him in front of the portrait, remembering his own early days of training when martial arts had seemed like a simpler, purer pursuit. "Your father understood the complications better than you realize. That's why he was so careful about what he taught and to whom. He knew that knowledge like this attracts both worthy students and unscrupulous opportunists." David finally turned to face him, his expression resolute despite the obvious weight of responsibility he carried. "Then I'll make sure his caution wasn't wasted. Tomorrow, I'll show everyone what it really means to inherit a traditional lineage." Marcus nodded, hoping that David's skill and determination would be enough to prevail against whatever Blackwood and Mendez had prepared. The next evening would determine not just the fate of Master Yamamoto's teachings, but the future of traditional martial arts preservation in an increasingly commercialized world. The evening of the formal challenge arrived with an unseasonable chill in the Los Angeles air. Tanaka's dojo had been transformed for the occasion. Mats arranged in a large square with the 7 council masters seated along one side. Representatives from various martial arts schools throughout Southern California filled the remaining space, word having spread quickly through the traditional community about this rare formal challenge. Marcus arrived early with David, wanting to ensure they had time to prepare properly. The young man had spent the previous day in intensive training, reviewing the family kata that would be central to the evening's demonstration. His movements had been sharp and focused, showing no sign of the nervousness that Marcus knew he must be feeling. Richard Blackwood entered precisely at the appointed time, flanked by Carlos Mendez and a small entourage of supporters from his chain of commercial schools. Mendez was an imposing figure, standing 6 feet tall with the lean, muscular build of a professional athlete. His black gi was immaculate, and he moved with the confident swagger of someone accustomed to physical dominance. Blackwood himself looked supremely confident, dressed in an expensive business suit that emphasized his role as a successful entrepreneur rather than a traditional martial artist. He surveyed the assembled masters with barely concealed disdain, clearly viewing this entire proceeding as an archaic formality that he would soon dispense with. Tanaka called the gathering to order with traditional protocols, explaining the nature of the dispute and the rules that would govern the challenge. The first phase would consist of kata demonstrations, with each representative performing traditional forms from the disputed lineage. Only if the council could not determine clear superiority in technical skill and understanding would the challenge proceed to actual combat. "David Chen will demonstrate first," Tanaka announced, as the challenger in this matter. David stepped to the center of the mat, bowing formally to the council and then to his opponent. As he assumed the ready position, the crowded dojo fell completely silent. Even those who had come to support Blackwood seemed to sense that they were about to witness something significant. The kata David chose was sanshin, one of the most fundamental forms in traditional Okinawan karate. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like a simple sequence of slow, controlled movements, but Marcus could see the depth of understanding in every gesture, the precise breathing patterns that coordinated with each technique, the subtle applications that revealed themselves through proper timing and positioning. As David moved through the form, Marcus felt transported back 30 years to Master Yamamoto's small dojo, watching the old master demonstrate these same movements with the same quiet intensity. The resemblance was uncanny, not just in physical technique but in the spiritual quality that transformed mere movement into meditation. When David completed the kata and returned to the ready position, the silence in the dojo was profound. Several of the council masters exchanged meaningful glances, clearly impressed by what they had witnessed. "Carlos Mendez will now demonstrate," Tanaka announced. Mendez strode to the center of the mat with obvious confidence, his bow perfunctory compared to David's respectful formality. He assumed the ready position and began the same kata that David had just performed. Technically, Mendez's performance was competent. He knew the sequence of movements, executed them with adequate power and speed, and maintained proper stances throughout. To a casual observer, his version might have seemed equal to David's, perhaps even superior, due to his greater physical strength and athletic conditioning. But Marcus could see the crucial differences that would be apparent to the council masters. Mendez's breathing was wrong, following his own rhythm rather than the prescribed patterns that gave the kata its internal power. His timing was off, rushing through transitions that should have been deliberate and controlled. Most significantly, his movements lacked the subtle applications that revealed true understanding of the form's combat principles. This was the performance of someone who had memorized choreography without comprehending meaning, learned technique without absorbing philosophy. When Mendez completed his demonstration, the difference in audience reaction was palpable. Where David's performance had created reverent silence, Mendez's conclusion was met with polite but restrained acknowledgement. Master Wong leaned forward to address both participants. We will now require demonstration of a more advanced kata from the disputed lineage. Please perform Seisan. Marcus saw a flicker of uncertainty cross Mendez's face. Seisan was one of the advanced forms that Master Yamamoto had taught only to David, part of the family knowledge that had never been widely shared. If Blackwood had somehow obtained this kata through his systematic theft of traditional techniques, Mendez should be able to perform it convincingly. David stepped forward first, his confidence clearly growing as he moved into familiar territory. The Seisan kata was more complex than Sanchin, featuring rapid changes of direction, intricate hand techniques, and applications that required years of study to understand fully. David's performance was flawless, each movement flowing naturally into the next while maintaining the explosive power that marked authentic Okinawan karate. When Mendez's turn came, his uncertainty became obvious. He began the kata confidently enough, but his movements quickly became hesitant as he encountered sequences he had clearly not mastered. Twice he had to stop and restart sections, his face flushing with embarrassment as he struggled to remember choreography he had obviously learned hastily and incompletely. By the time Mendez finished his flawed demonstration, the outcome was clear to everyone in the dojo. The council masters conferred briefly before Tanaka stood to deliver their judgment. The council finds that David Chen has demonstrated superior mastery and understanding of the traditional kata in question. His performance shows the depth of knowledge and spiritual development that can only come from legitimate transmission within a family lineage. Blackwood's face darkened with anger, but before he could object, Tanaka continued. However, Mr. Blackwood has requested the right to proceed to the combat phase of this challenge, claiming that martial effectiveness, rather than traditional accuracy, should be the ultimate test of legitimacy. Marcus felt his heart sink. Combat had always been a possibility, but he had hoped that David's superior kata performance would be sufficient to settle the matter. Now they would have to face Mendez's considerable physical advantages in actual fighting. The combat will consist of 3 rounds, Tanaka explained. Traditional weapons forms with bow staff, followed by controlled sparring with protective equipment, and finally traditional grappling if necessary. Victory requires superiority in at least 2 of the 3 phases. As the participants prepared for combat, Marcus approached David with final words of encouragement. "Remember everything your father taught you," he said quietly. "This isn't about winning a fight. It's about proving that traditional knowledge can't be stolen or faked." David nodded, his expression calm despite the magnitude of what he was about to face. Master Yamamoto always said that technique without character is meaningless, but character with proper technique is invincible. Tonight, we'll find out if he was right. The first phase of combat was about to begin, and with it, the final test of David's inheritance and worthiness to carry on his father's legacy. The weapons phase began with both participants selecting 6-foot oak bow staffs from the traditional rack maintained at Tanaka's dojo. David handled his weapon with the familiarity of years of practice, testing its weight and balance with subtle movements that demonstrated his comfort with traditional kobudo. Mendez gripped his staff more aggressively, holding it like a club rather than the extension of body and spirit that Master Yamamoto had taught it should be. The council requested demonstration of classical bow kata, beginning with basic forms and progressing to advanced sequences. David moved through the patterns with fluid precision, the staff spinning and striking in complex arcs that showed both defensive and offensive applications. Every movement served multiple purposes, each technique flowing naturally into combinations that could adapt to various combat scenarios. When Mendez attempted the same forms, his limitations became even more apparent than they had been during empty-hand kata. The bow staff required not just memorized sequences, but genuine understanding of leverage, timing, and spatial relationships. His performance was choppy and uncertain, clearly showing that he had learned these techniques recently and superficially. First phase to David Chen, Master Wong announced after brief consultation with the other council members. The sparring phase presented David's greatest challenge. Here, Mendez's athletic superiority and professional fighting experience would be most apparent. Both participants donned protective gear and assumed fighting stances as Tanaka outlined the rules for controlled contact. Mendez opened aggressively, launching a series of powerful kicks and punches designed to overwhelm David through sheer physical dominance. His techniques were fast and strong, but they lacked the subtle timing and positioning that marked traditional karate applications. David responded with the patient, defensive strategy that Master Yamamoto had emphasized in his teachings. Rather than meeting force with force, he used angles and timing to deflect Mendez's attacks while creating openings for counter techniques. His movements seemed almost effortless, flowing around his opponent's aggression like water around stones. The turning point came midway through the second round. Mendez, frustrated by his inability to land clean techniques against David's elusive defense, committed too fully to a spinning kick that left him momentarily off balance. David seized the opening with a perfectly timed sweep that sent Mendez to the mat, followed immediately by a controlled strike that stopped just inches from his throat. "Point to Chen," the referee called, and Marcus saw the first flicker of doubt cross Blackwood's face. The remainder of the sparring phase continued in similar fashion. Mendez possessed superior strength and speed, but David's technical mastery and tactical intelligence allowed him to control the pace and flow of the encounter. By the final round, it was clear that David had achieved the superiority in at least 2 phases necessary for victory. Tanaka called a halt to the combat before the grappling phase became necessary. "The council declares David Chen the victor in this formal challenge," he announced. "He has demonstrated legitimate mastery of the disputed techniques and the right to teach them as part of his inherited lineage." The assembled masters and spectators burst into applause, but David's reaction was notably restrained. He bowed respectfully to Mendez, who accepted the gesture with surprising grace despite his obvious disappointment. The formal protocols of traditional martial arts demanded dignity in both victory and defeat. Blackwood, however, showed no such grace. His face was flushed with anger as he approached the council table. "This is meaningless theatrics," he declared loudly enough for everyone in the dojo to hear. "Traditional kata and ancient customs don't mean anything in the modern world. I still own the copyrights, and I'll still pursue legal action." Master Wong rose slowly, her small stature somehow making her more, rather than less imposing. "Mr. Blackwood, you have been given the opportunity to prove your claims through combat according to traditions that predate your legal system by centuries. You have failed that test. More importantly," Tanaka added, "word of tonight's events will spread throughout the traditional martial arts community. Every legitimate master in Southern California now knows that your claims to these techniques are fraudulent." Blackwood looked around the dojo, seeing expressions ranging from disappointment to open contempt on the faces of masters whose respect he had hoped to maintain. His business model depended partly on credibility within the traditional community, and that credibility had been decisively shattered. "This isn't over," he said finally, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. He gestured for Mendez to follow him and stalked out of the dojo, leaving his supporters to trail behind in embarrassed silence. As the formal proceedings concluded and spectators began to disperse, Marcus found himself overwhelmed by a mixture of relief and pride. David had not only defended his inheritance successfully, but had done so with a combination of skill and character that would have made Master Yamamoto proud. Tanaka approached them as they were preparing to leave, carrying a small wrapped package. "This belongs to you now," he said, presenting it to David. "It's Master Yamamoto's teaching license from Okinawa. The the document that authorizes him to transmit traditional techniques to worthy students. He gave it to me for safekeeping years ago, asking me to pass it on to his heir when the time was right. David unwrapped the package with trembling hands, revealing a scroll written in elegant Japanese calligraphy. The document was old and fragile, but it represented an unbroken chain of transmission stretching back centuries to the origins of Okinawan karate. "What does this mean?" David asked. "It means you're no longer just Master Yamamoto's son," Marcus replied, understanding the full implications of what Tanaka had just revealed. "You're his official successor, authorized to teach his lineage and pass it on to the next generation." As they drove home through the Los Angeles night, David was uncharacteristically quiet. The weight of what had just occurred was clearly settling in. The recognition that he now carried responsibilities that extended far beyond his personal relationship with his father's memory. "What happens now?" he asked finally. Marcus smiled, feeling more optimistic about the future than he had in years. "Now we build something that honors both tradition and progress. We create a place where authentic martial arts can thrive without being corrupted by commercial exploitation." "Together?" "Together," Marcus confirmed. "Your father trusted me to guide you, but tonight you proved that the student has become the teacher. From now on, we're partners in preserving what he left us." 3 months later, the Harrison Yamamoto Academy opened its doors with a new mission statement that emphasized traditional values alongside modern teaching methods. David's certification as Master Yamamoto's official successor had attracted students from throughout Southern California, people seeking authentic martial arts instruction rather than commercial entertainment. Richard Blackwood never followed through on his legal threats. The damage to his reputation within the traditional community had been too severe, and several of his top instructors had left to join more legitimate schools. His empire of commercialized martial arts remained profitable, but its influence on traditional practitioners had been permanently diminished. Standing in the main training hall of their expanded academy, Marcus watched David lead a class of advanced students through the same kata that Master Yamamoto had taught decades earlier. The techniques were unchanged, but they were being transmitted to a new generation of practitioners who understood their value as both physical skills and cultural treasures. The legacy lived on, protected by honor and preserved through dedication. Master Yamamoto's most important lesson had been confirmed. True martial arts knowledge could not be bought, sold, or stolen. It could only be earned through years of patient study and demonstrated through a lifetime of principled action. The circle was complete, but the tradition would continue.